Good morning. My name is David Kelsey, and I'm appointed to do the honors this morning. An announcement, please. Remember that following tomorrow's lecture, there will be an opportunity for conversation, questions, and answers with Professor Alston by telephone. Professor Wolterstorff will preside at that. The request is that if you have questions for Professor Alston, you write them out ahead of time. And there are cards for that purpose that are available for you in the Sarah Smith Gallery downstairs. Welcome to the second of the 2005 Nathaniel Taylor Lectures. Their overall title is Divine Mystery and Our Knowledge of God. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Nicholas Wolterstorff, my esteemed and beloved colleague, Professor Emeritus of Philosophical Theology here. But he's not the Taylor lecturer. He's already had his shot at this, for heaven's sake, a couple of years ago, and very memorably, too. Now, this year, Professor Wolterstorff is the voice of the Taylor Lectures. Actually, Professor Wolterstorff was asked to be the commencement speaker at Calvin College last spring, but he was famously bumped from that position by our esteemed president. So this is Nick's sort of consolation prize. The author of this year's Taylor Lectures is Professor William Alston, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Syracuse University. Unfortunately, ill health prevents his being here to deliver the lectures himself. So I suppose, on some analogy to God, Professor Alston is mysterious to us, unseen and imperceptible to eye or ear here. And yet we may say in some way present. Professor Alston proposed in yesterday's lecture that God's mystery means that we are unable to apply truly any positive concept of God, though we may be able to apply negative concepts to God truly. However, unlike the case of God, we can truly apply positive concepts to Professor Alston, to give a uniquely descriptive account of him that picks him out. And that helps to cut down on his mysteriousness. For example, Professor Alston is one of America's most distinguished philosophers. He's the author of over 150 articles and a dozen books. He has a long and influential interest in the philosophy of religion and in philosophical theology. Moreover, as with God, we can truly apply negative concepts to Professor Alston. For example, neither Professor Alston nor God are Professor Wolterstorff. A point with which Mrs. Wolterstorff will heartily agree. Professor Wolterstorff once published a terrific book called Divine Discourse, explaining what it means to say that the Bible, though written by human authors, is the Word of God in which God's intent is in some way made present among us. One analogy he uses is that of an ambassador who is empowered by a government to speak for that government. What the ambassador says is the word of that government and makes the authority and power of that government present in international consultations. So maybe, if we think of Professor Wolterstorff on the same analogy, we can say that Nick's very person as ambassador is the way in which Professor Alston is somehow also present. The title of today's lecture is, Why Should We Take Divine Mystery Seriously?
Thank you, David, on behalf of myself and Professor Alston for that wonderfully witty introduction. It was terrific. I learned afterwards yesterday that some of you could not hear my voice, and thus could not hear Professor Alston either. I don't think it's that I've got such a soft voice. I think that this has been set for Harry Stout. I think that's so I'll try to do better today. So let's find out. Can everybody now, right now, hear me? Running throughout, we're going to have references to the thesis that was spelled out yesterday, what Alston calls the Divine Mystery Thesis. David mentioned it. Let me have it before us one more time. It's this, that no positive concepts, negative concepts will be different, that no positive concepts that belong to the human conceptual repertoire, none of those positive concepts apply truly to God as God is in himself. So let's do our best to keep that in front of us. As I say, if this were an old-fashioned classroom, I'd write it on the blackboard with chalk. Before entering onto a critical exposition of reasons in support of the Divine Mystery Thesis, and one more thing, throughout here the I, remember, is Alston. The I, the me, the myself is not Nick Wolterstorff, but Bill Alston. Before entering onto a critical exposition of reasons in support of the Divine Mystery Thesis, I will say a bit about the difficulties that attach to attempting to establish any negative thesis. In general, a true positive thesis can be established where it can, much more simply and straightforwardly than a negative one can be established. The true hypothesis that a copy of a certain book is in my study can be conclusively established by simply taking it off the shelf and exhibiting a copy of the book. But the true hypothesis that a certain book is not in my study can be conclusively established only by a laborious and time-consuming search. I think Bill is thinking of a sort of messy library here, in which you would have to do a laborious and time-consuming search. Wouldn't be true of everybody's library. The same contrast applies to the present topic. The positive view that some concept can be truly applied to God can be conclusively established by applying some concept to God and showing it to be true. Not as easy, admittedly, as showing that a certain book is in one's study. But the negative thesis that no humanly available concept can be truly applied to God is another matter altogether. No matter how long I may have tried without success to show that some concept truly applies to God as he is in himself, the possibility remains that some concept, somewhere, such concept does apply. There's no fixed limit to the variety of concepts that can be formed and used, after all, by human beings. Nor with respect to a given concept is there any fixed limit to the ways in which one may try to show that it does truly apply to God. Hence, the prospects for conclusively establishing the Divine Mystery Thesis, that no such concepts apply, by this direct approach, are as close to zero as makes no difference. There are other less direct ways of arguing for the Divine Mystery Thesis, non-inductive ways we may call them, since they do something other than generalize from our failure to find any concepts that are strictly true of God. So let's look at some of those considerations that make no pretense of conclusively establishing the thesis, but rather indicate that it's the sort of thing that we should expect. First, if we think about the relation of human cognitive powers to the absolutely infinite source of all that is other than itself, it is surely reasonable to suppose that the former, our cognitive powers, would not be able to get an account of the latter, the infinite source, that is exactly correct. We've got a hard enough time crafting an adequate account of the physical world, not to mention mind and society. How much less can we expect such a good result when we turn our thoughts to an infinite source of all being? Yeah, but isn't it possible for God to reveal to us certain truths about his nature, purposes, activities, and so on? Yes. But given the way God has chosen to interact with us, in order to communicate with us, God has to use language that we can understand. And the conceptual limitations of such language is one form of the disability that's just been suggested, the inability of human concepts to fit onto the infinite source of being. But if Jesus Christ is divine, you might protest, don't some of his utterances come completely up to the mark? Well, this runs into the same problem of these utterances being couched in human language and thus subject to the same limitation. Another line of thought that has the same kind of bearing actually on the problem stems from the puzzles, paradoxes, and insoluble problems to which theological thought so frequently leads. In Christianity, the central doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation are good examples of the point. Despite strenuous efforts by the best minds, the explanation of how there can be only one God, but three divine persons, and how one individual, Jesus Christ, can be both fully human and fully divine, seems persistently to elude our grasp. And moving to less distinctively Christian themes, there are the familiar paradoxes of omnipotence, of absolute goodness and freedom, of divine omniscience and human free will. In fact, so strong has been the aura of mystery that pervades much of traditional Christianity that the movement of natural religion in the 18th century was impelled in part by the felt need for a form of religion in which everything would be clear and simple and well within the grasp of the normal human intellect. For that matter, the problem of evil that even the natural religion of the 18th century could not escape, as Hume pointed out, spawns mysteries aplenty. Why does God allow such a massive human evil as the Holocaust, not to mention the ravages of disease? Attempts have frequently been made to dispel the apparent mystery by constructing theodicies that are designed to explain why God has refrained from preventing such things. But despite the ingenuity of many of these attempts, it has to be said that none of them has commanded general assent. And to many of us, Job still seems the appropriate response to the problem, one that leaves the mystery unresolved. My process theology friends will tell me that if I would just cease clinging to an unreasonable attachment to absolute divine omnipotence, the evil in the world wouldn't seem so mysterious. But for reasons I'm not going to go into here, I'm not inclined to go the route of process theology. Now, those of you who were present at the first lecture will recognize that this recital of mysteries in Christian theology will recognize that this recital is of things that I was there concerned to distinguish from the kind of mystery affirmed by the divine mystery thesis, which says that no positive concepts are applicable. Now, I've got no intention to go back on that, but what I'm doing here is sketching another part of the picture. I'm pointing out that although these areas in which we lack explanations of something or an understanding of how something is possible represent a kind of mystery that is distinct from what the divine mystery thesis alleges, and hence cannot straightforwardly claim to establish the divine mystery thesis, still with these, what these observations succeed in doing is the more modest enterprise of suggesting that it wouldn't be surprising, at all surprising, if this more radical mystery, the one suggested by the divine mystery thesis, were true. Okay, so those were preliminary remarks, and now for the main argument of this lecture by Alston. Now I come to what I regard as the most convincing basis for taking the divine mystery thesis seriously, and that's this: our experiential acquaintance with God. More specifically, a certain kind of experience of God, one typical of the mystical tradition, or more generally, the contemplative tradition. And then parenthetically he remarks, in the first lecture I touched briefly on the question of whether it is possible to perceive God, and I referred you to my book, Perceiving God, which Nick Wolterstorff, said was a terrific book, for a defense of the positive answer. But in that book, you're not going to find much about distinctively mystical or contemplative experience of God, more about ordinary experiences of God, at least until a second edition appears, on which I have been working off and on, mostly off, I fear, up to now. It's noteworthy that something like the divine mystery thesis is mostly found in those traditions within Christianity and within other religions, such as Judaism and Islam. So first I'm going to give a few examples of the espousal of the divine mystery thesis from the Christian contemplative tradition. And then what I'm going to do in the remainder of the lecture is explore the kind of experience of God that we find there and ask how and whether it provides support for the divine mystery thesis. My first witness is the 5th or 6th century mystical theologian Dionysius, the pseudo-Areopagite, who exercised an enormous influence on medieval theology and was the prime source of the mystical tradition in subsequent Christian theology in the Middle Ages. So here's a passage from Pseudo-Dionysius. The divine is not soul or mind. It is not order or greatness or littleness. It is not immovable or in motion or at rest, and has no power and is not power or light, and does not live and is not life, nor is it one, nor is it Godhead or goodness, nor does it belong to the category of non-existence, nor to that of existence. Alston now. One can hardly represent God as more mysterious than that. Backing up a century or so, there is Gregory of Nyssa, for whom the soul's ascent to God is a matter of its drawing closer to one who is utterly different from oneself, and hence is absolutely unknowable. It is an ascent into the divine darkness. The experience is one of an obscure but certain presence. The soul is, and now a quotation from Gregory, the soul is encompassed by a divine night, during which the spouse approaches but does not reveal himself. He gives the soul some sense of his presence, even while he eludes her clear apprehension, concealed as he is by the invisibility of his nature. The divine darkness in which the soul is united in love with the unknowable God is the summit of spirituality for Gregory. And here are some other statements from the late medieval and early modern periods. Meister Eckhart writes of the Godhead, the unfathomable mystery of the divine nature, which he terms the abyss or source or the silent desert, God as he is in himself, to use my term. Nicholas of Cusa, in his De Docta Ignorantia, speaks of the incomprehensibility of God, and reminiscent of Dionysius, he says that all that we know of God is what he is not rather than what he is. God contains and transcends all distinctions. Nicholas attributes this doctrine to a mystical illumination that he received. And in the 14th century, the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing tells us that to our intellect, God, quote, is ever more incomprehensible, end of quote, and hence to dwell with him, we must enter the darkness, the cloud of unknowing. It is only by love he may be gotten and holden, by thought, never. And finally, St. John of the Cross teaches us that the only way to grasp God cognitively, my phrase, says Alston, the only way to grasp God cognitively is to attain union with God in love, which in turn requires detachment from all created things. So an assembly from the mystical tradition. Though it would be pleasant to display learning about these and other celebrated figures, to do so would involve becoming embroiled in an exegetical maelstrom, which would not only soon exhaust my powers, but also inflate this part of the lectures unduly. So what I've chosen to do is to illustrate and explore the way the divine mystery thesis has been construed and supported experientially by concentrating on two contemporary or near-contemporary figures, two American Trappist monks, Thomas Merton and Thomas Keating. Thomas Merton is by far the more famous of the two, and as introducers of lecturers are fond of saying, he needs no introduction. Keating is the leading figure in the centering prayer movement, which is an attempt to present the Christian tradition of contemplative prayer in a contemporary dress. Focusing on these figures, as opposed to the figures from the medieval and patristic tradition, has the advantage of dealing with expositions that are formulated in language and modes of thought more in tune with contemporary ways of speaking and thinking. So we avoid the need for time-consuming interpretation of less familiar idioms. Before delving into their writings, let me say something as to what I'm looking for and how I'm going to treat these sources. The main things I want to glean from these sources are, one, how they present the divine mystery thesis; two, what kind of experience of God they take to reveal God as he is in himself; and then three, just how, if at all, the experience provides support for the thesis of divine mystery. My use of their writings is complicated by the fact that their concern is different from that one. I am interested in how a certain kind of experience might provide epistemic support for a thesis, the divine mystery thesis. By contrast, their concern in their writings is not that epistemological concern. Their concern is to help people to relate to God in a certain way, one that invokes as its highest development a maximally intimate union with God. And they take this to be the complete fulfillment of human potentiality, the ultimate end for which we were created. And they also think that insofar as we attain this kind of union with God, we will have the most complete kind of knowledge of God as he is in himself that is attainable by human beings. But for them, this latter is a byproduct of the spiritual journey rather than the point of the whole enterprise. And in this, they are typical of the Christian contemplative and mystical tradition. The point of the enterprise is to live a certain way. As a result of these differences in what they and I are primarily aiming at, I cannot expect my guides to give direct answers to my epistemological questions. That would be like expecting the author of a practical guide to getting one's life in order to provide answers to theoretical questions about personality dynamics. So I'm going to have to take what they say in the pursuit of their program and seek to show how it can be used to provide answers to my more theoretical questions. Okay, so with that in mind, let's begin by looking at espousals of the divine mystery thesis by our two Trappists. Early in his book Open Mind, Open Heart of 1986, Thomas Keating writes the following, quote, "Contemplative prayer is the opening of mind and heart, body and emotions, our whole being, to God, the ultimate mystery, beyond words, thoughts, and emotions." He goes on in more detail, Keating does. "Anything that we perceive of God can only be a radiance of his presence and not God as he is in himself. When the divine light strikes the human mind, it breaks down into many aspects, just as a ray of ordinary light, when it strikes a prism, breaks down into the varied colors of the spectrum. And there's nothing wrong with distinguishing different aspects of the ultimate mystery, but it would be a mistake to identify them with the inaccessible light itself." That was Thomas Keating. In Thomas Merton's book, New Seeds of Contemplation, we find this passage. "Contemplation is, above all, awareness of the reality of the source of our being. It knows the source obscurely, inexplicably, but with a certitude that goes beyond reason and beyond simple faith. It is a knowledge too deep to be grasped in images, in words, or even in concepts. And then again from Merton, the living God, the God who is God and not a philosopher's abstraction, lies infinitely beyond the reach of anything our eyes can see or our minds can understand. No matter what perfection you predicate of him, you have to add that your concept is only a pale analogy of the perfection that is actually in God. And that God is not literally what you conceive by that term. If nothing that can be seen can either be God or represent him to us as he is, then to find God, we must pass beyond everything that can be seen and said and enter into darkness. Since nothing that can be heard is God, to find him, we must enter into total silence. Since God cannot be imagined, anything our imagination tells us about God is ultimately misleading, and therefore we cannot know him as he really is unless we pass beyond everything that can be imagined and enter into an obscurity without images and without the likeness or concept of any created thing whatsoever. That's the end of the passage from Merton. Right at the beginning of this is now Alston again, right at the beginning of my tapping into my two guides, we are confronted with what I said to be the difficulty of using them for my purposes. Whereas for my agenda, I distinguish between espousals of the thesis, the divine mystery thesis, and the depiction of the kind of experience that supports it. Merton and Keating present the espousal of the thesis in connection with talking about the experience. It's the experience, rather than the doctrine or the thesis, that is in the center of their attention. And hence the latter, the thesis comes in only as related to the experience. Now, one thing to be noted is that Merton and Keating dissociate God as he is in himself from any conceptual grasp more fully than do some other prominent figures in the mystical tradition. Eckhart provides a good illustration. Eckhart distinguishes between God, personified as Trinity, and what he calls the Godhead, which is the unfathomable mystery of the divine nature. And for Eckhart, it is only the Godhead that is a mystery to the conceptual intellect, not the Trinity. Now, this distinction goes well beyond my earlier suggestion that the divine mystery thesis has to be restricted to what God is in himself. Because, look, surely the Trinity is an aspect of what God is in himself, and Eckhart thinks that we can gain some conceptual grasp of the Trinity. So Eckhart doesn't really count as an unqualified advocate of the divine mystery thesis as I understand it. But there's no such shilly-shallying in my two contemporary guides, or in John of the Cross, or the Cloud of Unknowing, or in many other figures in the Christian tradition. Their denial of true conceptual application to God cuts all the way. Okay. So now what I want to do for a while is focus on the kind of experience that is claimed, at least implicitly, by these guides to support the divine mystery thesis. And that is touched on in the initial quotations, but a lot more remains to be said. First, let's contrast it with a more familiar kind of experience of God, one the subject takes to show God to have various features or aspects that we can grasp conceptually, various distinct properties or attitudes or actions that we can notice, label, and file away. This is the kind of experience touched on by Keating in the second of the passages quoted from him. Let's call those experiences contentful. In saying that they are taken by the subject to be experiences of God as having various properties or performing various actions, we don't necessarily suppose that in the experience itself the subject is applying or in any way using concepts. That may or may not be true. But the point is that they are experiences that are, at least in retrospect, if not at the time, taken to be awarenesses of God as so-and-so, where these so-and-sos are capable of being encoded in concepts. Now, obviously, these contentful experiences that Keating refers to are, by their very specification, useless for supporting the view that the divine nature is incapable of being grasped in concepts. Contentful experiences of God can be intensely ecstatic and even overwhelming, and as a result, those who undergo them are liable to place great importance on them and take them to be the most intimate kind of relationship to God. But most of the masters of the spiritual life deflate those pretensions. They not only deny that such ecstatic, contentful experiences constitute our ultimate fulfillment, they warn us that because of their supreme attractiveness, they can be obstacles to going beyond even them to the true end for which God created us, an intimate, loving union with God, and then carrying that out in all aspects of our lives. They don't claim that these contentful, ecstatic experiences are without value and significance. As I say, many people need them to keep them on the spiritual journey, but they caution us. This is not the ultimate destination of the journey. And Keating and Merton continue that long tradition in this respect. But if that's true, what kind of experience could conceivably support the divine mystery thesis? Well, the passages I have cited speak of a kind of experience that can yield knowledge of an unconceptualizable deity, but this they do in almost purely negative language. It's beyond any use of concepts, they say. Images, words, emotions, or any other human mode of representation. It's a darkness, an obscurity, a silence, a cloud of unknowing. The only positive thing in all these passages is Merton's statement that the experience is an awareness of the reality of the source of our being. It knows the source obscurely, inexplicably, though with a certitude that goes beyond reason and simple faith. And this tells us that it involves a certain knowledge of God as he is in himself, but it doesn't do anything whatsoever to indicate what kind of experience enables us to achieve this knowledge of God. So what's the experience like? The one that goes beyond the contentful, ecstatic experiences. The short answer is pretty clearly that final ultimate experience is an experience of maximally intimate union with God. Getting beyond all self-centeredness and concern with oneself, and letting God take over one's life as far as that is possible for a human creature. Something that can be experienced, but which is far more than any experience. But since we're concerned to find the experiential basis for the subjects believing that this is what is going on, we need to explore what there is about this experience that provides a support for the belief that it's putting you in union with God. How do you get from this felt experience to that interpretation? Since Merton, along with the other contemplatives, once again has a different agenda, he simply announces that union with God is the way to know him as he is in himself, and then describes the experience to illustrate it. He doesn't start with the experience and then say that it really amounted to an intimate union with God. Here's what Merton says. God cannot be understood except by himself. If we are to understand him, we can only do so by being in some way transformed into him, so that we know him as he knows himself. And he doesn't know himself by any representation of himself. This is all Merton. His own infinite being is his own knowledge of himself, and we will not know God as God knows himself until we are united with what God is. The very obscurity of faith, still Merton, the very obscurity of faith is an argument for its perfection. It is darkness to our minds because it transcends their weakness. The closer we get to God, the less is our faith diluted with the half-light of created images and human concepts, and our certainty increases with the increasing obscurity. And it is in the deepest darkness that we most fully possess God on earth, because it is then that our minds are most truly liberated from the weak created lights that are darkness in comparison to him. It is then that we are filled with God's infinite light, which seems pure darkness to our reason. That was Merton. Before exploring further this kind of experience, that's Alston's concern, what kind of experience is this? I must point out that it will be its most highly developed form that I will examine. Once again, a person goes through a long period of spiritual development before undergoing anything that could be termed an experience of union with God. Although splashy experiences of the sort dismissed by the contemplative masters, those with some sort of content, can and do happen unexpectedly to people who have undergone no prior preparation, this is not the case with the kind of experience now under discussion. There may be hints or brief foretastes of the final consummation while the pilgrim is on the road, but to fully appreciate what's distinctive of such an experience, we have to concentrate on the most fully developed form. And we have to remember that to carry out our program, we must not relapse into characterizing the experience as an experience of union with God or of being transformed into God, or as an immediate knowledge of God as He is in Himself. That wouldn't tell us what it is about the experience that provides support for these characterizations. So you see what Alston is up to. He wants the experience. We'll raise the question as whether it's an experience of God, but let's start with the experience. When the mystics describe it, they describe it as an experience of God, but in principle, you've got the experience, and the claim is that it's of God. It will help to lay out more specifically those theses for which we're looking for evidential support in the experience. They can be briefly enumerated as follows. He's got 4 of them. We're looking for experiential support for 1. At its fullest development, contemplation involves a union with God. Can that be supported by the experiences? At its fullest development, contemplation involves a union with God. 2, we're looking for support for 2, that this union involves sharing God's life with us, and in particular His knowledge. Do the experiences give support for that thesis? 3, we're looking for support for this 3rd thesis, that this experience enables us to have a knowledge of God as He is in Himself, that goes beyond concepts and is far superior to any other knowledge we can have. Do the experiences support that conclusion, that we get a knowledge of God as He is in Himself that goes beyond concepts? And 4th, of course, we're looking for support for the divine mystery thesis, that God is completely inaccessible to accurate description, true description by positive concepts. So in looking for what there is about the ultimate contemplative experience of God that supports those interpretative claims, let's begin with phenomenal features. They're just perceptible features of the experience. So what's the experience like? Together with previously cited passages from Merton, consider the following passage from Keating. Quote, "We are totally present now, with the whole of our being, in complete openness. The past and future, time itself are forgotten. We are here in the presence of ultimate mystery. Like the air we breathe, this divine presence is all around us and within us, distinct from us but never separate from us. We may sense this presence drawing us from within, as if touching our spirit and embracing it, or carrying us beyond ourselves into pure awareness. We surrender to the attraction of internal silence, tranquility, and peace. We do not try to feel anything, reflect about anything. Without effort, without trying, we sink into this presence, letting everything else go. Love alone speaks. The simple desire to be one with the presence, to forget self, to rest in the ultimate mystery." So here we find the following phenomenal features. Peace, description of what the experience is like. Peace, tranquility, love, joy, rest. The last described by Keating as rest in a greater degree than in sleep. Elsewhere, Keating speaks of the experience as contentment, a sense of coming home, a sense of well-being. And looking forward to the next passage from Merton, we can throw in a sense of drastic simplification and unification of consciousness. Okay. A state of consciousness with those features is powerfully attractive and impressive, and can easily lead its possessor to attribute to it a central importance for one's life. But it's also clear that these features, contentment, sense of coming home, love, joy, peace, so forth, it's also clear that these features do not by themselves show that one is enjoying a union with God, or indeed is experiencing God at all. They could be produced by any of a number of causes, physiological, temperamental, or reactions to incidents in one's secular life that have nothing directly to do with God at all. Okay. So is the situation markedly altered by bringing into the picture a sense of the presence of God as a description of the experience, which also was stressed by Keating? Well, that adds something very significant, but it still doesn't bring us to a slam-bang case for the whole experience being a direct awareness of God, much less for a slam-bang case for the experience being union with God. Senses of presence can be counterfeited, as is thoroughly documented in William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. Here I must make a general point about attempts to establish experiential theses from appeals to experience. How do you move from experience to claims about what's outside the experience? What can be indubitably derived from the experience is how things seem to the subject. Any further inference from just the sheer experience is subject to questions as to whether things are as they seem to be to the subject. So if we're going to derive experiential conclusions, in this case about God, from just the contemplative experience, there's no alternative but to taking the word of the reporters of the experiences as to what the experiences reveal to them. So with respect to our guides, we can distinguish between reports of phenomenal features of the experiences and reports of what the experience is really of and what are the relations to God that it involves. When we're looking at these, Keating, Merton, their description of the experience and their claim about what it's really of. Thus, Keating speaks not only of sensing this presence drawing us from within, that's just limited to the experience, but also flatly claims that, quote, this divine presence is all around us and within us, distinct from us, but never separate from us. And that's going outside the experience and speaking about God. And Merton claims that contemplation is, above all, awareness of the reality of the source of our being. So where our guides make claims of this extra experiential sort, the issue boils down to us, for us, as to whether they are to be credited with getting things right. Here are some reasons, says Alston, for thinking that for taking our guides at their word when they go outside just the phenomenal experience and make claims about what it's really of, for taking them at their word. He's got four reasons here. Here are some reasons why we should take them at their word when they say it's really of God. A, they're in the best position to know what is happening, especially since such experiences are not shared with the population in general. B, there's a significant number of witnesses that tell roughly the same story, thereby providing some sort of interpersonal confirmation. C, what they report as the ultimate fulfillment of human potentialities is coherent with what is believed about God's intentions as creator in Christianity. And third, and D, another consideration is this: the quality of their lives, the influence and the work of leading contemplatives gives us some confidence that they know what they're talking about when they say that it was an experience of God. Now I come to a very important kind of report, one concerning the sort of knowledge that the experience constitutes. Here's a key presentation by Merton. Says Merton, the utter simplicity and obviousness of the infused light which contemplation pours into our soul suddenly awakens us to a new level of awareness. We enter a region which we had never even suspected, and yet it is this new world which seems familiar and obvious. The old world of our senses is now the one that seems strange, remote and unbelievable, until the intense light of contemplation leaves us and we fall back to our ordinary level. Compared with the pure and peaceful comprehension of love, in which the contemplative is permitted the truth, not so much by seeing it as by being absorbed into it, ordinary ways of seeing and knowing are full of blindness and labor and uncertainty. Still Merton, the sharpest of natural experiences is like sleep compared with the awakening which is contemplation. The keenest and surest natural certitude is a dream compared to this serene comprehension. Now back to Alston. Putting this together with earlier passages, Merton is telling us that by a fundamental transformation in which the subject becomes united to God as much as possible in this life, one has a taste of what it is to know God as God knows himself. And this knowledge, he realizes, the mystic, to be something radically different from any knowledge that we can capture in concepts in our ordinary modes of thinking and speech. On general grounds, it would be implausible to suppose that God knows himself by means of concepts. But Merton and others tell us that this is further confirmed by the experience in which one is united to God in such a way as to share, insofar as that is possible in this life, the knowledge that God has of himself. And since the knowledge God has of himself can hardly be anything other than a knowledge of God as he is in himself, this seems to show that there is indeed a non-conceptual knowledge of God as he is in himself that is open, to some degree, to humans in this life. Now, this doesn't still get us to the divine mystery thesis, which says that that's the only way to know God as he is in himself. But be patient. We're almost but not quite finished with critical questions. The argument that I've just extracted from the material, we are united to God, and hence it is that it's beyond concepts. God wouldn't know God's self with concepts. The argument that I've just extracted from the material will only work, to say it once again, if it really is God that one knows experientially in the way that's being claimed. So once again, why suppose that? Grant that one is aware of something, even that one has attained a union with something and shared its knowledge of itself. So the mystics are right in going outside the experience and saying that it's of something. Why suppose that the something is God? Well, the answer to this challenge has to be multifaceted. First, let's note that there are features of the experience that strongly suggest that it's an experience of God. The phenomenal characteristics like peace, love, rest are the sorts of things one would expect to be granted to the seeker by God. And consider the ways Keating represents the object of the experience. Immense, yet so humble. Awe-inspiring, yet so gentle. Limitless, yet so intimate. Tender, yet so personal and personal. Now, many participants in theistic religions wouldn't expect God to be humble, gentle, and tender. But a case can be made in Christianity for the incarnate God to have displayed himself exactly as such. And the same can be said of speaking of this presence as, here again we quote, healing, strengthening, refreshing, non-judgmental, self-giving, seeking no reward, boundless in compassion. End of that quote. Some Christians would quibble at some of those attributions, but I would say that we have here a nice balance of antecedently expected characteristics of God, antecedently expected from the Christian tradition on the one hand, and some that are less expected, revealed in the contemplative experience. So a great deal of the reason for taking the experience to be not only of something, but to be of God, can be ranged under the heading of the route by which the contemplative arrives at the experience. People who are walking on the contemplative path are by no means unacquainted with God, and they possess resources for referring to God long before they arrive at that transforming union. So they're on a path, a way. And as for referring to God, leaving aside the possibility of a purely perceptual identification, they have plenty of uniquely applicable descriptions to use for a descriptively based reference. Source of being for all other than himself, the most perfect possible being, the paradigm of goodness, and so forth. Hence, as we might put it, these who are on the path, these contemplatives, these mystics, they're pretty well equipped to recognize a being as God if that being qualifies as God when they encounter him. Furthermore, they're earlier than union experiences of God in their lives. Imperfect though those experiences may be, because they included conceptual or imagistic mediation, will have taught them a great deal of what God is like in his dealings with creation. And we can't suppose that this is without relevance to what God is like in himself. And so all of this puts the contemplative in a pretty good position, as he's on the way, to identify a being as God. A simpler feature of the approach route consists of the fact that the contemplative uses her capacity to refer to God and carrying out the prayers, renunciations, purifications, appeals to God for enlightenment, help, guidance, and strengthening, repentances and requests for forgiveness, comfort and sustenance in dry periods, and other modes of interaction with God that are involved in the contemplative discipline. And a large part of this contemplative preparatory discipline consists in striving to detach oneself from undue attachment to goods of this world and from habits and practices that get in the way of opening oneself fully to the presence and activity of God within one. And such strivings are normally carried out in conscious interaction with God, primarily asking for help in what is typically a difficult task. So, since the contemplative reaches the ultimate consummation, in whatever degree she does, by virtue of these interactions with God, and explicitly in the pursuit of union with God, that is, in pursuit of just the kind of experience that she attains, given all that, what real alternative is there to concluding that the experience is, in fact, an experience of God that this mystic eventually arrives at, assuming that we haven't totally rejected the reports of our guides as to what's going on in the whole process? Well, that completes my case for the first three of the inferential goals I set out. Remember, the strategy was starting from just the experience, can we reach these conclusions? Conclusions that the mystic affirms, but is there good reason for it? One, at its fullest development, contemplation involves a union with God. Does the experience provide some support for that? Two, this union involved God sharing his life, and in particular his knowledge with us. And three, that this enables us to have a knowledge of God as he is in himself without concepts. So it looks, says Alston, as if the experience, mystical experience, provides rather good basis for reaching those conclusions. So that completes my case. What we're left with is just this more radical thesis, the divine mystery thesis, that no concepts, not just that there's a non-conceptual way to God, but no concepts apply to God as he is in himself. Here our guides desert us. Pretty definitely they do commit themselves to the divine mystery thesis. They don't attempt to lay out any inferential bridge from their experience to this more radical conclusion. And this is to be partly explained by the fact that they are not concerned with epistemological issues. But I suspect that it reflects a sense that the divine mystery thesis does not obviously follow from their experience or from the first three conclusions. In fact, there is an obvious analogy that tells against it. Here's the analogy. tells against moving directly to the radical divine mystery thesis, no positive concepts apply to God in himself, from the experience, which is an experience in which, a limited experience in which concepts don't apply. An obvious analogy. It's plausible to suppose that a human being H's knowledge of H's own conscious states is non-conceptual in character. Yet it's also clear that the knowledge any other person has of H's conscious states is not non-conceptual in character. So in this case, you've got both non-conceptual knowledge, of your own states, and conceptual knowledge that other people have of your conceptual. You've got both of them. Note, however, Alston says, that this human analog lacks the point that the non-conceptual first-person knowledge is all that much better than the conceptual knowledge that other people have about you. So even though the radical divine mystery thesis does not obviously follow from the conclusions about what the mystical experience is like, or from the experiential support for them, I do feel that there are considerations that strongly suggest that the divine mystery thesis at least fits naturally and comfortably with those other three conclusions about the nature of the mystical experience. Look at it this way. Those first three conclusions affirm that at the height of the contemplative way, the subject enjoys a union with God that involves God's taking over one's life and consciousness, and thereby sharing, among other things, his own knowledge of himself as he is in himself, a knowledge that dispenses with concepts or any other representations. Those are the conclusions. Put this together with the fact that our guides represent this knowledge as infinitely superior to any other knowledge that is open to us. Then, if, as I assuming, we are accepting our guides' reports as to what's going on in their experience, it's a natural conclusion that no other inferior knowledge could have a claim to be a knowledge of God as he is in himself. Why would God display himself as he is in himself to knowledge that's inferior to the best that's available to human beings? I think it's more plausible, says Alston, to hold that the knowledge God has of himself and that he shares with us in the transforming union is the only source of knowledge that can lay claim to being a knowledge of God as he is in himself, in his fundamental nature, apart from creation. So in conclusion, I freely admit that this inference to the divine mystery thesis is not a conclusive reason for accepting it, even if we have accepted the experiential reports that give us our other inferential goals. And if we consider the situation in its totality, including the support experiential reports give to the other inferences, the difficulties do multiply. The latter inference, from experience to claims about what's outside the experience, is subject to all the standard objections to arguments for conclusions about God, from unusual and spottily distributed experiences, as well as some further objections that stem from the obscure and even less widely distributed experiences of the kind under consideration here. Nonetheless, I believe that what I have presented does reach the more modest goal that I set for myself, namely this modest goal: exhibiting an experiential reason, that of the contemplatives, for taking the divine mystery thesis seriously enough to make it worthwhile to ask ourselves in the next lecture how it can live in harmony with its antithesis, the antithesis being that it is crucial for the Christian life to apply a variety of concepts truly to God. And that task will be undertaken in the final lecture.